Bonjour à toutes et à tous, quel plaisir de vous...
Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you again. Hello, Nathalie. Hello, Mika. It's a pleasure for us to come together because this year we could not meet at the agricultural fair. First of all, a piece of information. We were tested to find out whether it would be possible to be all together in this recording studio, but it is. So, are you okay? I'm fine. And you? Fine, too. You are very numerous with us today. It is this first edition, 2021. We are today the 8th of June, and this symposium has been organized by Bleu-Blanc-Coeur in cooperation with the INRAE, I for Environment, as well as the company Valorex. Bleu-Blanc-Coeur is a collective initiative that aims at the feeding of animals, but also favoring the health of human beings and the soil also of our earth. 7,000 farmers are part of the association today. 950 companies from the agricultural field and feeding have come together, as well as 17,000 citizens, committed citizens. And of course, we have health professionals among them, as well as people from the catering and food industry, as well as consumers. Today, it's also a branch, an activity branch, which has strongly developed in France, in particular for animal production. And we are for this symposium, One Health, very happy to welcome you. We have a lot of scientific knowledge that has been collected, and we will share that with you. Once again, like for the previous conferences, you may raise questions during the symposium. You have a chat access, and we will then try to answer those questions. Maybe not all of them, but we will try to do that. Isn't it that way, Nathalie? Yes. Okay. So, Nathalie, I hand over the floor to you. Thank you very much, Mika. It's a very nice introduction as regards BBC, Bleu-Blanc-Coeur. Very happy to be with you again. This Bleu-Blanc-Coeur One Health Symposium is dedicated to human health. Now, obviously, it has been a very complicated past year, and hopefully we're going to see the end of it. A lot of things have changed, and in between, we also have learned that we are all vulnerable as regards infections possibilities or to viruses, and that the solution is not obvious, is not holistic, but that maybe building up an agriculture which is going to be favorable to human health makes sense. We have we have a wonderful program for you, One Health, which is dedicated to human health. Human health, well, it started all with a lot of different studies from the CREDOC, and that reflect upon the changes, the changes that we have experienced, and yes, and it seems that last year we had only mentioned 10 to 12% of importance of animal health development. Now we have 15% of those companies which have committed to animal health and human health, because of course we are expecting from side of the citizens a greater demand as concerns the safety, security, and reliability of nutrition. Now, we will look at the way the body may resist to a virus. We talk about immunity, inflammation. We have two international specialists with us, probably the best ones. They are going to tell us more about that. And we will look at this healthy food. We call that the barrier food at Bleu-Blanc-Coeur. And we will tell us more about the way we introduce that. And to start with, we are going to, to hand over the floor to our Deputy Minister for Industries at the Ministry of Agriculture. Agnès Pannier-Runacher, and she will tell us more about the way the government looks at this development. Agnès Pannier-Runacher, thank you very much for being with us, and we listen to you. Hello, everybody. Food is a key factor for well-being and contributes in the prevention of diseases. However, we do not have enough contributions yet, but we would like to change that. From the industries, we expect more input, but also from the side of agricultures. It represents really an important challenge, and this is why I wanted to participate in this One Health Symposium. I would like to thank the organizers, the Association Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, who have been federating for more than 20 years producers, processors, and consumers. They are at the avant-garde of this challenge. I think it is very important to reflect upon the scientific research that has been led by our National Institute for Research, Agriculture and Environment, INRA, research on what we eat and the importance it has for our immunity. We would like this prevention nutrition to become the engine of virtuous economy. And we have gathered the best specialists. As I'm concerned as the Minister of Industry, I would like to initiate this new movement. Part of this recovery plan, we want to dedicate 7 billion euros for the coming year, 21-22, to the research in terms of good nutrition for a good health, a sustainable and good food for health. Of course, we would like to point out the importance of probiotics in dairy products, for instance. It brings an added value in terms of nutrition, and it lowers the use of incoming resources. It reflects upon the trend of consumers, this trend that citizens have to favor local products. We have based our strategy on 3 axes. One, which is centered on the science of the living beings, the importance of the intestinal microbiota and health. In particular, new proteins are aimed at, and fermented products also. The second axis is dedicated to the engineering sciences. We want to improve the information towards consumers and to answer their specific needs. And then we also want to develop territorial innovations like territorial food systems. And then the third axe is around skills, because it is particularly important to train young generations to those challenges and to increase the attractivity of new jobs. So it deals with public health, but also with employment. Parallel to that, we support the agro-food business within the plan which is called France Relance, to reinforce competitiveness. We know that this competitiveness is absolutely major for our food sovereignty. To master food in France means that we will have a possibility to interact on the quality of food, which means on our health. The money that we invest now corresponds to those challenges. We have around 60 different projects in France in the field of agro-food businesses, and up to today, 60 projects do represent 465 million euros investments with a potential of 2,200 jobs. Many of those projects aim at developing new protein sources, vegetal proteins. In Brittany, in Ile-de-France, in the Great Eastern region, we support projects for this search for new proteins. We also have projects dedicated to new cheeses made out of vegetable proteins and many others. But it's only a start, and the way is long. Research is indispensable to progress. And this is the reason why this symposium is important. Together, we have to mobilize around the link between nutrition and health. And I believe that the massive participation of agri-food businesses reflects upon their commitment in this way. I would like to thank them and recall that farmers and industrials are partners to leverage the quality of food for the health of all our consumers. I wish you a nice symposium and hand hand over back to you, Mika and Nathalie. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mrs. Pannier-Runacher. That's a wonderful introduction to this new agriculture. What you have pointed out, the management of agro-food to better master sanitary crisis. It is a subject that maybe has been a little bit left aside in the past, but this is why we have decided to have also a few scientific presentations to highlight that aspect. So again, thank you very much. In the name of Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, we are honored. Yes, indeed, we have many experts who are going to interact, but to have a kind of introduction micro-conference, who else than one of the co-chairmen of Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, Pierre Veille. Pierre, please don't hesitate to join us. We are waiting for you. Hello. And you may applaud Pierre Veille, just if you feel for it. Pierre, we listen to you. It's a micro-conference indeed. Only an introduction to tell you that 20 years ago we started working on that, and every year we meet to deliver the latest results in terms of research. We have presented results on animal health, clinical studies, and so by and by we also started talking about One Health, and this is the name of these meetings. So what does it mean? One Health. It's the unique health. This is a kind of marketing slogan. We have One Health around a healthy soil, healthy animals, and healthy human beings. We believe in that, and we try to feed a scientific basis to prove that the food chain dedicated to this One Health needs to be funded on scientific research. Now, of course, we can't avoid speaking about this overall context, which is the COVID pandemic. This is the number of cases of fatalities and vaccinated doses that have been administered. This is the COVID-19 dashboard. We have been going 1 year with those figures. We have tried to find the best possible vaccines, but have we talked about nutrition? Hardly never, if I may say, despite the fact that if we go back 1.5 years ago, you were all listening to those news, appalling news. But we talked a lot about the virus, but we heard about cytokine storms, about pneumonia, about inflammation, about immunity, so many things which are directly in link with food and feed for animals. So we have the first phase of this disease, which is viral. Then you have the inflammation that may lead to the acute disease or even death. Now, this
Louis Pasteur.
This conclusion can be handed back to the three people that we have here on this slide. It's about microbia, but microbia is not all. It's like our cells degenerating and becoming enemies of our body. It's not completely true, but it's not completely wrong. Pasteur knew what a microbia is, but and Claude Bernard, the father of experimental and modern medicine in France, would have said, well, indeed, the microbia is nothing. It is the field that matters. So we have hardly spoken about the field. In the scientific press, it was reflected, but not so much on our mainstream media. PubMed.government is a place where you can find more than 2,600 articles dealing with that field. Now, Professor Philip Calder is going to take the floor right after me, and if you give in immunity, etc., you will find or nutrition Calder, then you will find 122 articles reflecting upon nutrition and health. And Professor Harris from the South Dakota state in America, it's probably 7 o'clock in the morning, and we thank him very much because he raised up very early. Anyway, he published a lot on the link between inflammation, fatty acids, and nutrition. So we are going today to speak about the field, the forgotten aspect. And Professor Le Cerf also will tell us more about the barrier food, like we have barrier gestures, and we, as we call them in France, the social distancing measures. And well, you can see here you have the sun, you have vegetables, you have a fish, you have a field, and you have cheese and eggs and butter, etc. We will talk a lot about fibers, about vitamins. We will talk about nutritional density of food. We will talk about the production way of food also. So, what is One Health 2021? It has one ambition: to find a place for prevention for the future pandemics, because for this one it's probably too late, but maybe we're going to have more of those. And maybe people will raise questions about how it happened, why do people resist and why do others go to hospital and some of them even die? What about the density, nutritional density of the different food components? We will talk about chemistry, the chemistry that starts in the field, that goes through the plants and that ends up in our plate. This is from farm to fork. And so in order to do that, we need a healthy soil. And this is why we have decided to dedicate this session to the COVID context with this double challenge: climate, nutrition, and something, and this is our Leitfaden for more than 20 years, with measures. Everything can be measured. The environmental quality can be measured, the number of worms per hectare, etc., and the nutritional density can be measured, etc. So this logic of unique health, One Health, makes sense only if it is rooted in research and scientific evidence. So I would like to thank you very much. I mean, all of you, the participants, and also our speakers. Have a nice 21 session. Thank you very much, Pierre, for this introduction. And without further ado, we are moving on to the first sequence.
Nutrition, inflammation et immunité.
So, nutrition, inflammation, immunity. We are very happy to have with us someone from Southampton. He is a professor of immunology in Southampton. Philip Calder, you are considered to be the global specialist between nutrition and immunity. Thank you very much for being with us today. We are very happy to give you the floor and listen to what you have to say.
Great. Thank you very much. Thanks for the kind introduction, and thanks for inviting me to join you at this fascinating meeting today. I'm hoping someone's going to bring up my slides. Thank you so much. So Pierre has talked about the importance of nutrition in supporting the immune system. I think that's a really key point, because nutrition is important in helping the immune system, in helping to create and maintain gut microbiota, and in helping us to control inflammation. And all of those things are important as far as COVID-19 is concerned. I was asked to talk about polyunsaturated fatty acids, some chemicals derived from polyunsaturated fatty acids, and COVID-19. Next slide, please. So the immune system is what protects us from what we call pathogens. That's things like bacteria, viruses, and so on. It's our defense mechanism. Next slide. When we're infected, we need more energy, and that's partly because our immune system is energy demanding. It needs energy to do work. We need more building blocks, and that's because the immune system is actually creating things. It's creating proteins. For example, antibodies are proteins, and we need the amino acid building blocks to create those proteins. The immune system is also creating entire new cells, and we need the building blocks to produce those cells. Obviously, nutrition is important there. There are also regulators of processes involved in generating energy and in this building block stuff that I talked about. And these regulators are things like vitamin A, vitamin D, zinc, and so on. Of course, they come from the diet. Now, we already heard a little bit about inflammation. This is a sort of an adverse side of the immune response, if you like. We need to protect ourselves from damaging inflammation. And again, nutrients, I'm going to talk about omega-3 fatty acids later on, some antioxidant vitamins and minerals, they help us to control inflammation. So my point is that nutrition is involved in all of these different components that help the immune system do its job. Next slide, please. If we think about the progression of severity of an infection, like the coronavirus, of course, we start on the left in the uninfected state, and unfortunately, some people end up on the right-hand side with severe symptoms that can require significant hospitalization and can even be fatal. Obviously, there's a progression through rather modest or mild infection into stronger symptoms as people progress through the disease. Next slide. So we can think about different components of this trajectory. We can think about what Pierre called the viral component or the antiviral component, which is all about preventing infection and trying to stop progression to the next stage of the disease. Of course, later on, we need to think about treatment, and this is the inflammatory component that Pierre mentioned. We need to adopt treatments for strong and severe symptoms. Next slide. If we think about prevention, of course, we can prevent exposure. That's what the things like hygiene, self-isolation, social distancing, mask wearing, and so on are all about. But of course, we also need to help our immune system deal with the virus. We need to enable it to clear the virus so we have low-level infection, no symptoms, and of course, no progression to the next stage. Next slide. If we look at the far end of the disease, the severe disease, what's going on there? These are data from Chinese researchers published relatively early on in the pandemic, reporting here in two graphs. The graph on the left is presenting a marker of inflammation, and the graph on the right is presenting a marker of immunity. These are all patients hospitalized with COVID-19. The patients shown in the blue circles over time are patients who survived. The patients shown in the red circles over time are patients who unfortunately died. So immediately you see the blue and the red are different from one another. The patients who survived had less inflammation and better immunity, whereas the patients who died had weak immunity but excessive inflammation. So maybe we can think about strategies to treat immunity and to treat inflammation that will help in these viral pandemics. Next slide. You've heard the term cytokine storm. That's shown on the bottom left of this figure. This is an attempt I made to link the infection with coronavirus to the severe clinical outcomes, organ failure and death. And you'll see a cytokine storm, that means too much inflammation. That seems to be key to developing severe disease. And that's why people have hung on to this term cytokine storm. Next slide, please. So if we think about treatment, controlling inflammation and supporting the immune system are going to be really important. Next slide. So the question is there a role for polyunsaturated fatty acids here, either in prevention or in treatment? Next slide. This is a figure from an article I published in 2019. It also captures this idea of too much inflammation and weak immunity that we saw in the patients with severe COVID-19 who died. What I'm depicting here is following an insult, for example, a viral infection. Some people develop excessive inflammation and they also develop weak immunity. The excessive inflammation is linked to failure of organs, respiratory function, cardiac function, kidney function, and so on. The weak immunity, of course, means people can get infected with other bacteria, other viruses, and that's problematic. I'm going to suggest to you that omega-3 fatty acids can help control these extremes of excessive inflammation and weak immunity. Next slide, please. Firstly, I want to talk about omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids and then the omega-3 polyunsaturated fatty acids. Of course, there are many members of these families, and I'm going to talk about the members that are most biologically active. In other words, the ones that are most important in our immune and inflammatory systems. As far as the omega-6 fatty acids are concerned, it's arachidonic acid we need to think about. What this figure shows is that arachidonic acid in our bodies is converted to other chemicals. These chemicals are called prostaglandins and leukotrienes, and there are enzymes. COX means cyclooxygenase, LOX means lipoxygenase. These are enzymes that convert arachidonic acid into these chemicals. These chemicals together are called eicosanoids, and it turns out that these eicosanoids are actually part of the inflammatory response. In other words, omega-6 fatty acids give rise to chemicals involved in inflammation. And in fact, these eicosanoids produced from arachidonic acid are already known to be involved in respiratory disease, diseases like asthma and acute respiratory distress syndrome. So there's something about arachidonic acid and these eicosanoid chemicals that's linked with inflammation. Next slide. In fact, people have been interested in these chemicals produced from arachidonic acid in patients with COVID-19. These are two scientific papers. The paper at the top actually described these eicosanoid mediators in the blood of people with COVID-19, and they described people with severe COVID-19 having high levels of these chemicals, these eicosanoids, produced from arachidonic acid. And the bottom paper is a sort of a discussion piece that suggests that these chemicals, these eicosanoids, are an overlooked storm in COVID-19. So people talk about the cytokine storm, but these authors are suggesting there's also an eicosanoid storm. That is, chemicals produced from arachidonic acid and omega-6 fatty acid are central in COVID-19. Next slide. What about omega-3 fatty acids? Well, of course, there's a long story of omega-3 fatty acids from fish, that is EPA and DHA, and inflammation. This has been studied for 30 or 40 years now. And we know that omega-3 fatty acids have many anti-inflammatory actions. That's something we've been researching for several decades now ourselves. Talking about those anti-inflammatory actions of omega-3s, of course, would take us off into another story that would last a long time. So my point is simply, these fatty acids are known to reduce inflammation. Next slide. However, there's a new angle to the story of omega-3s and inflammation. There's a process which has been discovered about 20 years ago, which is called resolution of inflammation. Resolution means turning off. So resolution of inflammation is the turning off of inflammation. So if you already have an inflammatory state, you can add chemicals which will turn that off. Now, of course, that happens naturally in the body. People were interested in what are the chemicals involved in resolution of inflammation in the body. Next slide. And when they looked, they found out, perhaps to their surprise, that the chemicals involved in resolution of inflammation are made from EPA and DHA. That is, omega-3 fatty acids are key to resolving inflammation. So there are two aspects to omega-3s and inflammation. The first is that they are anti-inflammatory, and the second is that they are pro-resolving. That is, they drive the turning off of inflammation. This figure simply shows the chemistry by which the body converts EPA and DHA to the chemicals that resolve inflammation. These chemicals have these new names: resolvins, protectins, and maressins. Don't worry about the detail. Simply be aware that omega-3s are the key to the resolution of inflammation, the turning off of inflammation. Next slide, please. So, just to make that point again, EPA and DHA reduce inflammation. That is, they are anti-inflammatory, but they give rise to chemicals that turn off inflammation. That is, they're pro-resolving. These are two different but related effects of omega-3 fatty acids. Next slide, please. So the way I like to think about this is that EPA and DHA are master controllers of inflammation. They're really controlling the body's inflammatory state. Next slide, please. So coming back to my earlier figure, what I propose here is that EPA and DHA can be used to control the excessive inflammation and to strengthen the weakened immunity. Now, of course, people were studying this in the pre-COVID times, but this has become quite a source of discussion over the last 18 months. Because if this is true, then omega-3 fatty acids could be really effective in COVID-19. Next slide, please. Now, in fact, there are several trials of EPA and DHA in a condition called acute respiratory distress syndrome. This is a respiratory condition that already existed and was already a clinical problem, but it turns out that this is part of severe COVID-19. There's an experimental approach called meta-analysis. This is where researchers take results from several clinical trials or several studies that are similar to one another, and they put all of that data together to get a better picture of what's going on. Next slide. So this is the results of a meta-analysis that we performed of studies of omega-3 fatty acids in acute respiratory distress syndrome. This is from the pre-COVID era. So you see a lot of numbers on here. This is the statistical summary of the combination of findings from 11 different trials. What we identified when all of this data is put together is that EPA and DHA, and these are studies that were randomized controlled trials. So there's a placebo group, a control group, and an omega-3 group. So that's an important comparison here. And what this analysis identifies is that EPA and DHA result in better lung function, in fewer failing organs, things like kidney failure, heart failure, lung failure, and so on. Shorter length in the intensive care unit. That means patients must be recovering. And you see at the top, less death over 28 days. In other words, omega-3 fatty acids can be used to treat this condition, and they work pretty well. Next slide, please. So what this means is that omega-3 fatty acids could be used in patients with COVID-19. They could be used as a treatment. Next slide. In fact, there are a number of trials that are ongoing or that will start soon, testing whether EPA and DHA can be used to treat COVID-19. Next slide. In fact, one of those trials has been completed and has been published. So again, this was a double-blind, randomized trial, so omega-3s compared to control, in 128 patients in intensive care with COVID-19. All patients were receiving normal care, but one of the groups received omega-3 fatty acids, EPA and DHA, additionally to the other care. This was done daily over 14 days. On the right-hand side, you'll see the findings. So in the omega-3 group, there was better survival. So 21% of patients survived compared with only 3% in the control group. Omega-3 fatty acids improved kidney function, improved respiratory function, that is lung function, and they increased blood lymphocytes. Lymphocytes are important in immune defense. So there were positive effects of omega-3s in this study. It's important to note that there were lots of things these researchers measured that actually weren't different between the omega-3 and the control group. So the effects of omega-3s are quite discrete. They're influencing, in this study, things related to inflammation and immunity. Next slide, please. So they could have, omega-3s could have a role as a treatment. What about earlier on? What about prevention? Next slide. So we're not really sure because there aren't good studies that have been done looking at the preventative effect of omega-3s. I think Bill Harris is going to talk a little bit about this perhaps in his talk. But before that, I'll show you one more piece of data on the next slide. So this is data from a study that I happened to get involved in. This is a big study in 445,000 people who were using an app on their mobile phone. This app is called the COVID-19 Symptom App. And essentially here, we look at whether people tested positive for coronavirus or not. This is self-reported positive testing, self-reported negative testing. This is nothing about severe disease, hospitalization, all of those things. And we asked those people through the app about supplements they were using. And these are the data for use of omega-3 supplements. And they're data for 3 countries, the UK in red, the US in green, and Sweden in blue. And if you just look at the left-hand graph, you'll see that there are similar data for the UK, the US, and Sweden. And what this is showing is that people who were consuming omega-3 supplements were less likely to test positive for coronavirus than people not using omega-3 supplements. So this is a suggestion that omega-3s might actually be preventative. They may help the immune system deal with the infection very early on, so the infection is cleared and people test negative. I think this is a very intriguing observation, and I'd like to see more data about omega-3s and prevention of coronavirus infection. Next slide, please. So there are possible roles for omega-3s in both treatment and prevention. So I think they can be useful right along this trajectory here. Let's move to the next slide. So what I've told you is that chemicals produced from the omega-6 fatty acid, arachidonic acid, are involved in inflammation. I told you that COVID-19 is associated with high levels of these chemicals and referred to the eicosanoid storm. I mentioned that omega-3 fatty acids have multiple anti-inflammatory actions. That's been very well described over the last 30 or 40 years. I also mentioned the newer discovery that omega-3 fatty acids give rise to chemicals that are involved in resolution of inflammation, turning off inflammation. I showed you a meta-analysis that describes that giving patients with acute respiratory distress syndrome omega-3 fatty acids has benefits as far as respiratory function, need for ventilation, organ failure, and mortality are concerned. And then at the end, I mentioned trials of EPA and DHA in the prevention of COVID-19 and in the treatment of COVID-19 are underway. And the data that's been achieved so far, the results that we have so far, are very encouraging for omega-3 fatty acids. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, EPA and DHA may have a role in reducing risk of COVID-19 becoming more severe. They may have a role in treating severe COVID-19, but whether they have a role in prevention is not clear from the data that's available at the moment. Thanks very much for your attention.
Merci, professeur Calder, pour cette, je dirais, brillante et très pédagogique.
Thank you very much, Professor, for this brilliant, very educational speech. I think you just led the undeniable scientific foundation that nutrition is at the root of the factors that regulate inflammation and immunity, right? These two mechanisms that are largely involved in, let's say, the infectious and viral diseases that society suffers from. I really want to make the link, perhaps, with what Bleu-Blanc-Coeur has been doing for 20 years now. I mean, we've been really working on improving things, working on omega-3s, the good balance between omega-3 and omega-6 in a balanced nutrition. I think, yeah, you've really, let's say, echoed in a way what we've been doing for 20 years now. So that's very, very nice and very, yeah, very nice to hear. And so you see that, yeah, well, omega-3s and omega-6 are regulated by food and by diet. And well, even though I'm blood, I'm going to try this this image. So it's as in a car, right? The brake and the accelerator, so or the gas pedal. And so well, the omega-6 are, let's say, act as a brake to make sure that the inflammation that could well become excessive does not in the end have a bad impact on our health. So well, for 20 years we've been doing this and working on this, and you've just shed light in a few minutes on what we've been doing for 20 years. So that's really great. Thank you very much. And quite often it's been said that, you know, we know all of this, we've heard of this all again. So now that we know all of this, we cannot just do as if we didn't know, right? We need to consider all of this now and work with all our partners about this. All right, thank you, Natalie. So, we are now going to listen to another scientist who is a professor of medicine at the University of South Dakota. And he is ranked in the top 2% of scientists, let's say, with the most influence worldwide in all categories by Stanford University. And so he is with us today, Professor William Harris. You have carried out quite recently studies, and namely with regards to the impact of omega-3s in blood. So, well, you have the floor now, Professor, and you're going to tell us more about these new trials you've been working on and new data you can share with us, because it is very, very interesting. You have the floor, Professor.
Thank you very much. Very pleased to be here, and as always, to be on the same stage, even virtually, with Philip, good friend, and as you mentioned, some survey recently that placed scientists in percentiles, and I must say, you said I was in the type 2%. Philip was in the top 1%. So you've got some serious omega-3 scientists in this symposium today. We'll begin with my opening slide, and it's a very simple statement, and we'll just continue, I think, with the theme that Philip has certainly introduced. People with higher blood omega-3 levels are at lower risk for death, and again, from COVID, and then we'll even look at data for beyond COVID. And so, as mentioned, I am in Sioux Falls, South Dakota. Next slide. I'll give you a little picture of the fact that even in the north central plains of the United States, we do have waterfalls. This is the falls of the Sioux River that go through our town. Okay, let's get to the science. Next slide. So I will, by way of overview, talk about some of the associations with inflammatory markers. And again, some of this is overlapping with Philip, and I think that's good. It's good to hear these things more than once from different angles. Hopefully will be more readily remembered. We'll look at the effects on biomarker levels from giving omega-3s. So it's one thing to have an association between omega-3 and biomarker levels. It's another thing to show that giving omega-3 changes the biomarker levels. We'll review quickly what Philip mentioned already, the acute respiratory distress syndrome meta-analysis, which was very compelling. We'll talk briefly about a study that we published in January on omega-3 and risk for death from COVID. And then I'll spend some time on a paper we've published about 2 or 3 weeks ago, looking at omega-3 levels and all-cause mortality, well beyond the COVID situation today. Next slide. I'll be talking about a biomarker of omega-3 status we call the omega-3 index. This is the amount of EPA and DHA in red blood cell membranes. It's expressed as a percent of total fatty acids. So we want to get some idea of how much omega-3 a person has in their tissues. This is a good way to express it. And so this is a cartoon, this red blood cell on the photo, and it's got a cutaway and a little cartoon pull out of what we call the lipid bilayer, a membrane. This is the way all cells are built in the body. They have a bilayer, a top and a bottom layer of lipids. And in this cartoon, you see 4 red ones and the rest of them are blue. And we'll assume those red ones are the omega-3 fatty acids, because this is where the omega-3s typically are found, is in membranes. And all the other ones are not omega-3. So there happen to be 64 fatty acids, which are the little tails of the kites here that are shown in this picture. 64 of them, there 4 of them are omega-3. Very simple math. 4 out of 64 is 6.25%. So that would be the omega-3 index for the person from whom this red blood cell was taken. And so we use that metric several times during this talk. So that's what I want to introduce. Next slide. What's a healthy or normal omega-3 index? We believe from our work and that of others that a desirable omega-3 index is somewhere in the 8 to 12% area. If you look at this scale on the right side, on the right end of it, the green area is that 8 to 12% area. That's typical for countries that consume a lot of fish, like Japan, South Korea. These would be average levels, would be in the 9, maybe 8, 9, 10%, which is remarkable. In the U.S. and Europe, most of the Western world, we're down in the 4, 5, maybe 6% omega-3 index level. So typically, folks in Japan and Korea do live quite a bit longer than Americans do, actually. Comparing Japanese mortality rates with American, Japan is number 2, I believe, and America is something like number 34. Japanese live about 4 years longer on average than Americans do. They have a omega-3 index that's twice as high. And you can't necessarily say that's cause and effect, but it's consistent with the idea that a higher omega-3 level is associated with a greater longevity. Next slide. So jumping into the relationships between omega-3 and inflammation, Philip did a masterful job, as always, looking at this general field. This is a table out of a paper we published 6 years ago here in what's called the Framingham Heart Study, Framingham Offspring Study. This is a large cohort of people, healthy people, that have been followed over many years taken from a suburb of Boston, actually, called Framingham. We looked at this group of people and we measured their omega-3 index. This was around 2,700 people. And we correlated the omega-3 index with all of these different biomarkers. We don't have to get into the specific ones, but each one of these 10 chemicals that's listed on this graph relate to inflammation, either typically pro-inflammatory. If we look on the right-hand side, inside that blue box, we see a bunch of negative numbers under the R column and p-values. Negative numbers simply mean there's an inverse relationship between the omega-3 level and the level of these inflammation markers. That means a higher omega-3 level is associated in this large group of people with lower levels of these inflammatory markers. And they cross a wide spectrum of different types of inflammatory markers. So there's a generalized favorable relationship between omega-3 and the inflammatory state, as Philip said. Next slide. Well, it's one thing to say that there's a relationship between omega-3 and inflammation. There's because that could be caused by other factors that really are unrelated to omega-3. It's harder to say that the omega-3s are unrelated to inflammation if you actually give omega-3 fatty acids and show that they reduce inflammatory markers. So in this one study from a few years ago, a small study, but it makes a point that we've seen in others, we have a randomized control trial where 3 different biomarkers of inflammation were measured, IL-6, IL-1 beta, and TNF alpha. Don't worry about what these mean, but they are chemicals that are pro-inflammatory mediators in the body, reflections of a mediation. And if you can see across we're looking at omega-3 levels at baseline at week 4 and week 8. So it's looking at 1 month and 2 months of giving EPA and DHA. And they were given about 2.5 grams of EPA and DHA per day versus a placebo. And in each of these markers, as time went on, the omega-3 treated group saw a decrease in these inflammatory markers, whereas the control group, there was no change, as you'd expect. And so we can conclude that giving omega-3 actually does reduce these inflammatory markers. The authors quote, on the left-hand side, they use kind of a fun term that I enjoy. They say, quote, long-term EPA and DHA therapy may be a safe, relatively low-cost dietary intervention to help prevent or assuage what they call inflammaging. This is the inflammation associated with aging. It doesn't have to be associated with aging; it can be associated with anything. But they like this term, and they say, and associated diseases that greatly diminish the quality of life for aging adults. And I do agree with that, actually. Let's go to the next slide. Now, Philip summarized the next 3 slides in one slide, and I think that's probably going to make the point that needs to be made here. This is, again, a meta-analysis and a pooling of many different observational or randomized trials, studying people with acute respiratory distress syndrome. And the studies are listed over here on the left. Each one of them is an individual randomized trial. And then we look over here on the right and we see if this green dot is on the right-hand side of this 0 line, it means that the omega-3 treated group did better. And this is looking at one of the markers that Philip talked about. This is called it's written here, don't have to go through it, but what that fundamentally means is it's how much oxygen is in the blood versus how much oxygen is breathed in. And of course, the more oxygen that you breathe in that gets in the blood, the better. And so there's a beneficial relationship here with higher omega-3. The group that got omega-3s had higher levels of this particular marker. Next slide. And as Philip also mentioned, days of ventilation. Now here we want to have fewer days of ventilation associated with giving omega-3, and that's on the left-hand side, and this is a beneficial effect. And the next one is probably the most important. Next slide. Would be total mortality, that means death from the acute respiratory distress episode. And again, if it's on the left-hand side, it means those that got the omega-3s were lower risk for death. And so this fits with the story that the omega-3s can calm this inflammatory storm that occurs with this particular disease. Next slide. Let me jump now into the COVID world, and we'll spend a little time in COVID and then get into other things. But there was an interesting paper published earlier this year that looked at the reported intake of EPA and DHA, marine omega-3 fatty acids, in different regions around the world. And the countries that comprise those regions are shown on the left box. There are 6 regions with many, many countries involved. And the average omega-3 intake of each of those regions was calculated. And then using WHO data, the authors put together this graph that looks like the higher the omega-3 intake of the region, the lower the death rate from COVID. Now, this is again, very much of an association. We don't know at all that the omega-3s are causing this, but it's consistent with the idea that we've both been talking about here today. Next slide. And this taken again from the paper I think that Philip showed us, looking at supplement use and positive testing for COVID-19. He showed you the beneficial effect. I wanted to point out that when people were queried about what supplements they were taking and how they were either positive or negative for COVID, there are 4 different groups of supplements that seem to be associated with better health. Omega-3s on top. If it's blue or dark blue, and the typing inside it is bold, that means statistically significant. So people taking omega-3s, people taking probiotics, people taking multivitamins and vitamin D all had lower reported infection rates from COVID-19. So it's not just the omega-3s. There's something favorable about all these, apparently. One thing that's interesting, if we look down at the bottom, the 2 types of supplements that were not associated with being positive or negative for COVID are vitamin C and zinc. Despite all the press that zinc particularly got, it's interesting to see that there was really no relationship, but there was for the omega-3s. Next slide. Now, this is one slide. It's the only slide I'll show from the study that we published. We were interested, we actually had the opportunity to look at blood omega-3 index levels in a small group of patients at a hospital in Los Angeles, California, individuals who were admitted to the hospital with COVID. And then we knew very little about them other than the fact that they lived or died. And so if one transports oneself back to the winter of 2020, and there were many papers being published about omega-3, why omega-3 should be helpful in COVID, but nobody had reported any actual data showing that it actually was beneficial. So we had this opportunity to do this pilot study with colleagues again in California. And we looked at omega-3 levels in this group of 100 patients, and we ranked people from the highest omega-3 level to the lowest omega-3. So there's 25 people in each group. Those are called quartiles, of course. So we looked at each quartile of omega-3 from lowest to highest, and we looked at the risk for death in the hospital during that time. The data for that is shown in sort of the center of the graph here. We look at Q1, Q2, Q3, Q4, what's quartile 1, quartile 2. And there is a somewhat of a trend toward lower risk for death in those that were in the higher quartiles, except for quartile 3, which is kind of an oddity, seemed to be a higher risk for death. It turned out that that particular quartile had the oldest people in it to begin with. So that's sort of weighing it against and causing increased risk for death. But if we look at the very bottom, the last essentially 2 lines, comparing quartile 1 through 3 with quartile 4, meaning look at the people just in the highest 25% of omega-3 versus everybody else, versus the lowest. And we found there in the red a what we call an odds ratio, or a risk in a sense, 0.25, which means that people who are in that 5.7% or greater omega-3 index, which is quite low, actually, it's a relatively low omega-3 index to begin with, their risk tended to be considerably lower, they're 75% less likely to die. This was not quite statistically significant, but this was a pilot study, after all, again, done in the context of a increasing need for actual data on omega-3. And so we felt like we could publish this even if it was not quite standard statistical significance, because we needed some data out there. So this I think, is very much a pilot study, and hopefully others much larger will be done soon that we can confirm this finding. But we certainly have a strong suggestion that a higher omega-3 was associated with a better outcome here. Next slide. Back to the group that published that graph showing the regions of the world and their omega-3 intake and the risk for death. That particular piece of data was part of the introduction to the paper here by Vivar Sierra and colleagues, published in Molecules here this year. And the point of the paper was to suggest that a very novel mechanism by which omega-3 might reduce risk for infection, not for necessarily not just lowering the cytokine storm associated with the disease, but actually reduces the risk of the virus getting into our cells. And this mechanism relates to the spike protein. We've all come to know and love the spike protein on the outside. We've seen this image on the news for months and months now. So on the left-hand side here, we see the little virus, the little COVID-19 virus outside the cell with its green spike proteins around it. We see this thing called ACE2. That's the name of a particular receptor or a binding site on the outside of a cell that binds to this particular spike protein. And once it binds, it pulls that virus inside the cell, and then all the havoc happens when the virus gets inside the cell and begins to replicate. That's the trouble. So on the left-hand side, we have this context where they say low EPA and DHA intake. This is what happens normally. On the right-hand side, where everything is green and happy, we have a high omega-3 EPA and DHA intake, and they have data that would support, this is really very much a hypothesis study, but they have data that would support the idea that if you have high DHA levels in the blood, that the DHA actually interacts or binds to this spike protein while this virus is outside of the cell, and it locks the spike protein in a particular shape, and in a shape that makes it not very easily taken into the cell. This ACE2 binding site, as we see here, can't really bind and take in the virus if this spike protein is in a particular shape or conformation. And having higher DHA levels causes that spike protein to not be in a conformation that allows it to be taken up. So this would be consistent with the idea that having a high omega-3 would reduce risk for actual infection per se, in addition to those people, when infection does occur, the omega-3s can, via the eicosanoids and the resolving mediators that Philip talked about, can reduce risk for disease. So this is a novel idea that needs to be pursued, but a rather clever one, I think. Next slide. Let me get now into a study we recently published, leaving COVID behind and just dealing with, on a very macro level, death from anything and omega-3 levels. So this is a paper we published in the journal called Nature Communications. The title of it was Blood N3 or omega-3 fatty acids and total and cause-specific mortality from 17 prospective studies. Philip mentioned a meta-analysis. That's essentially what this is a meta-analysis of pooled data from 17 different studies looking at this question: how does the omega-3 level in the blood relate to risk for death? And the bottom line is here over on the left, omega-3 levels are linked with reduced risk for premature death. And by premature, we simply mean people who die earlier than they would otherwise had they had higher omega-3 levels. That's what premature means in this context. Next slide. So in this study, we included about 42,000 people who were part of these 17 studies. The studies were done in 10 different countries. The mean age of all these people was roughly mid-60s, about half and half men and women. Blood levels of omega-3 were measured in all of these people at the beginning of the study, because these were, again, all prospective observational study. And a prospective observational study is a study where a group of generally healthy people are recruited by a researcher, and they are studied, their blood is studied, their habits are studied, their diet is studied and recorded. And then you just follow these people over many, many years to see who gets sick of what diseases and associate it back with either dietary patterns or blood levels of different markers. So again, omega-3 was measured. Follow-up time was around 16 years. So on average, these people were followed from the time their blood was drawn and omega-3 was measured for 16 years. So we're looking at the risk for death during this period of time, say between age 64 and 80. That's the follow-up time. Of course, if you wait long enough in these studies, everybody dies. So you have to look at a particular window of time and ask, is there a relationship between the biomarker, again, omega-3 levels, and risk for death in a window of time? There were about nearly 16,000 people died during this follow-up period. About 30% died of cardiovascular disease, 30% from cancer, and about 40% died from everything else. So we looked at the omega-3's association with each of these kinds of types of death. Next slide. This is a complex slide. We call it a forest plot because of all these dots in the middle and this dashed line. The important, on the left-hand side is a whole bunch of acronyms, and each one of these is the 17 different studies that were involved. Some measured omega-3 levels in the blood, rather than red blood cells, or in the plasma, or in other lipid compartments. But we were just interested in looking at the risk for death, comparing the 90th percentile, in whatever blood compartment omega-3s were measured, 90th percentile versus the 10th percentile. And these, again, dots that go down the middle with the bars going left and right are the estimated risk of death, comparing the 90th to the 10th percentile. At the very bottom right, we have a box that says 0.87, and 0.87 means that there is a 13% lower risk of death during the follow-up time in people who had the highest versus the lowest omega-3 index levels. And these analyses were all controlled for a variety of other risk factors that might be related to risk for death, and they were not. Next slide. So the question is, what associated omega-3 index would be linked with these risks? So this graph here generally gives you the same kind of idea. Over on the left-hand side is the 10th percentile for this group of, what was it, 45,000 people, the 15,000 that died. People at the 10th percentile, we'll call that our reference group, and set that value at 1 on the far left column. And then as the omega-3 index goes up to the 90th percentile on the lower right, you get a reduction down to about that 85% or 15% reduction. The omega-3 index associated with that 10% is roughly 4% omega-3 level. And the level associated with the 90th percentile was about 7.7%. So this is pretty good confirmation, I think, of the original proposed idea that under 4% is where you don't want to be. And over 8% is really the best place for optimal health. Next slide. I mentioned we were looking at other causes of death besides just total mortality, and this graph here shows that on the left-hand side. That group of five columns is the relationship between risk for death from anything, that's total mortality, as a function of increasing omega-3 levels. So each column represents 20% of the population we studied. The lowest bar is the lowest omega-3 group, and the far right bar is the highest omega-3 blood level. So you can see that the higher the omega-3 level, the lower and lower and lower the risk for death is. And this applies not just for total mortality, it applies for cardiovascular disease. You can see the same trend for cancer, and you can see the same trend for all other causes of death. So the important take home here is that higher omega-3 levels are associated with lower risk for death across the board. It's not just a cardiovascular question. It's not just heart disease that we're thinking about omega-3. We have to think about it as an overall health across all systems of the body. So this is a good, strong confirmation that the omega-3s are playing a widely important role, probably through anti-inflammatory mechanisms. Next slide. So I'll conclude here that higher omega-3 EPA and DHA levels, they do have potent anti-inflammatory properties. I think Philip drilled that down very well. That high blood levels or tissue levels, because the omega-3s measured in the blood do reflect what's in your tissues. They are linked with the lower risk for death from acute respiratory infections. We saw that. Possibly from COVID. We need more data, but that's a suggestion at this point. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, all causes of death combined. So that makes us think that the omega-3, getting in a high omega-3 level in your blood, which comes from eating more EPA and DHA, is a great strategy for prolonging life and living longer and healthier. Thank you very much.
Merci, Dr. Harris. Bravo pour cette intervention.
Thank you very much, Dr. Harris. This is an impressive aspect of all those studies that were made and that reflect upon the interest of having a high intake of omega-3 in human food. I love your approach. I mean, we have results of studies, but of course we tend to extrapolate to passive prevention, public health challenges. I also appreciated what echoes to what we are dealing with at Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, because we have been busy with that for 20 years now. There is this obligation of result, and we constantly measure this nutritional balance of the food that we bring on our plates and the consumers' plates. And you have measured this this omega-3 index, and it really it gives us appetite, if I may say so, on moving on with you to support you. I mean, those results echo to our work. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, Nathalie, that was a full sequence. We would like to thank Professor Calder and Professor Harris, and we will come back to you later on for the Q&A. But now we move on to the second sequence, which is called barrier food.
Et nous allons passer au côté pratique, Nathalie. On l'a bien compris, notre
And we move on, Nathalie, to the practical aspect.
Un spécialiste.
We are going to call upon Jean-Michel Le Serre. He's a specialist, and you are in charge of the nutritional department of the hospital in Lille, and you are going to tell us more about the barrier food. What kind of nutriments and to which doses our food and nutrition helps and interacts on our health?
Super. Well, so is there a place for what I would call a barrier food or diet against COVID-19? So this is one thing I would like to talk about with you this afternoon. So I'm trying to, let's say, shed some light on this issue and perhaps answer in a way what would be called a, let's say, a protective food or to fight COVID-19, because, well, we've had these protective measures that we've had to abide by for a year now, right? So what about protective food? So, well, we've been working on this for quite some years, and we know that our immunity is, let's say, linked to different factors in life, and namely our lifestyle. So, broadly speaking, let's say, and we'll be going over these one after the other, but just to give you, let's say, a broader picture of what this is all about. So we have, obviously, nutrition and... but when it comes to nutrition, well, there's what we call malnutrition, which could be, let's say, an excess of nutrition or a deficit of nutrition, which in both cases is malnutrition, right? Then there's also the way of life, right? So if you don't have enough movement, this could mean so taking on weight. There's also stress, which is linked to your lifestyle, to the lack of sleep. Many people nowadays undergo a lot of stress because of their lifestyle, because of the rhythm of their life, because of their activity or inactivity. And all of this can have an impact on our microbiota and therefore on our immunity. So all of this is obviously theory, but well, it could allow us to perhaps let's say see how our lifestyle can play a role in protecting us against the COVID-19. So, undernutrition is a very important topic to talk about. So this is also malnutrition, but this is a deficit nutrition. And so this can be linked to various reasons, right? Socioeconomic conditions, poverty, ignorance. And this undernutrition is not something that impacts everyone But many people nonetheless suffer from undernutrition, either because of socioeconomic conditions or because of, it can be, I don't know, it could be various restrictions, it could be diseases, anorexia, obesity, it could be any other kind of illness, age, it could be various psychological disorders. In any case, all of these issues have an impact on our immune system, on our antibodies, on our proteins, which obviously are closely linked to our lifestyle. And so this is how we are going to go about this. Now, we also know that obesity has played a very important role in COVID-19 for various reasons. Now, obesity can be linked to malnutrition, some kind of malnutrition, right? It could be either an excess or a lack of nutrition, right? So because you are fat or overweight, so you're going to, let's say, undergo very strict diets. So this could, lead to illnesses, right? And this will have an impact on your cells, an unbalance, and the pro-inflammatory cytokines that are produced, and all of this, can link to this cytokine storm, which is the most spectacular form, let's say, of COVID-19. Now, if you add to this dysbiosis element, so we'll come back to this, right? The dysbiosis, is an unbalance of the gut microbiota. And all of this all of these symptoms are seen in obesity, and all of this put together with COVID-19, obviously leads to very unpleasant results. And this, in France, touches roughly 15% of the adult population. So if you summarize what we now would like to go about, not with regards to the lifestyle, but with regards to nutrition, we will try to develop this in a very brief way, obviously. The things that have already been said, so omega-3s, I'm not going to dwell on this, but I'll say a few words. But then there are also other things which are extremely important, vitamin D, for instance, and various other nutrients or let's say elements of nutrition which can play a role on inflammation and on immunity. So you have two parts in the COVID-19, right? Immunity and inflammation, which can play a role within the case of COVID-19. So there has been some interest in listing the various interesting nutrients, let's say. Many people have tried to do this in various different publications. So you have iron, zinc, selenium for in animal feeds, and then you have also in plants vitamin C, vitamin B9. And we know that when there are, let's say, when there are issues linked to the immunity, when the immunity is impacted, obviously this can lead to complications. But this needs to be taken into account within the context of a major disruptions. And now there are other nutrient candidates. So we've talked about proteins already. They play a role, obviously, in the globulin protein synthesis. Then there are various vitamins, vitamin E, vitamin D, which come from a mixed origin. Then you have the fatty acids, omega-3s, omega-6. They can be animal or plant omega-3s. And then you also have, let's say, a very specific part of nutrients which are from fermented dairy products, right? So probiotics, and then you also have the prebiotics. So you have polyphenols, for instance. So you have so many different candidates, but it's not because you are part of the candidates that you actually pass the exam. So who will pass the exam, right? Which candidate will take it? So there have been a few studies from various doctors with regards to vitamin D. And I should say, for instance, that they've been studies on vitamin Ds in supplemented animals with regards to COVID. And there have been various other studies, observation studies, in human beings. So the COVID plus patients usually have a low vitamin Ds, and those that have low vitamin D levels usually have more severe COVID symptoms, and the supplemented subjects usually have a lower COVID symptom. So now the problem is that there is a lack of randomized studies to be sure that these are not just coincidences, and that these patients could actually have, let's say, more severe diseases and not necessarily linked to this lack or excess, but just a correlation. So vitamin D is not just a vitamin, it's also a hormone, and it's mostly synthesized. And it turns on a considerable number of genes, right? 3% of genes that are modulated by the 125-OH2D, sorry. And this is after binding to the receptor, right? And so in this case the SARS-CoV, which is present in the virus. So vitamin D is an extremely important vitamin, but it's not just a vitamin, as I said. It's also a hormone. It is, let's say, it comes from food, but it's also, let's say, created in our body. It's created at level of the skin. So 70% comes from the skin, and 30% comes from food, a lot from animal food, and then a bit from also vegetables, so mushrooms, namely, but not only. So now the question is, why do some people have deficits? Well, it's linked to various reasons, because we do not eat enough food that creates vitamin D, or because we do not spend sufficient time outside, because we're not sufficiently exposed to the sun. Well, there are various reasons that can explain why people have vitamin D deficits. And namely in Europe, but not only in Europe. So anyway, vitamin D is a good candidate, but we do not have sufficient data to prove this be the case. So to be perhaps even more, let's say, concrete in our approach, what we see is that in our lifestyle and in our diets, well, there's so many different reasons that could link to unfavorable reasons with regards to, let's say, the influence on our immunity, and namely food. In fact, so you have, I don't know, too much food, too much refined food, not enough sun, too much meat, too little fish, or whatever, right? So there are various diets. So let's look at them closely. And by the way, one thing that perhaps requires me to shed a bit of light on it before I move on to my conclusion. So, microbiota, it's not because it's trendy that you talk about it, it's because, well, there have been different studies, and I'm not going to be able to go into too much detail about these, but what we know is that when there is dysbiosis, right, so an imbalance in our microbiota, well, this can lead to infections, and the complications linked to COVID-19 could be explained by this, but not only various other infections, right? So there is some kind of a double move. Let's not forget that microbiota is, 100 trillion bacteria, 400 square meters of its intestinal mucosal surface, 100 million neurons, and most of all, 60% of the body's immune cells, right? So that's quite substantial. And so you cannot just put it aside when you look into these issues, because it has a very big connection with the nervous system, with the blood, with the lymphatic system. And we all have, all share this microbiota. Obviously, it will differ from one person to the other, and from the beginning of our life, well, we will be impacted differently due to different events in our life, and this will explain why different people have different microbiota. But in any case, we all have a microbiota, and it can be impacted by, namely, the mode of delivery when giving birth, right? Obviously, breastfeeding or not will have an impact on our microbiota, and various other events that you can see here on the screen: antibiotics, gastroenteritis, food diversity, fibers, prebiotics, rhythms, stress, tobacco, additives, salt, pyrotics, you name it. All of these have an impact on our microbiota. If you take an example, many studies have shown in the animal realm, right, of animals that, let's say, have a standard diet or a cafeteria diet, let's say, fast food diet, but they're not all are, let's say, they're not all the same, let's say, but anyway, a lot of fats, a lot of sugars, not enough fibers, so the impact is negative on the microbiodiversity, on the firmicutes also. And this will lead to various inflammations, namely endotoxonomy, namely. So just to sum up the role of our microbiota, well, there are two key elements here. Firstly, there is the microdiversity, which is linked to everything I just mentioned, right? So food, the various events in our life, be it at birth, so the way, the mode of delivery, right, breastfeeding or not, age, food. So there are various reasons that could lead to a dysbiosis. But there are other elements that can be taken into account. So it could be viruses and various other parts, alcohol, overweight, that can have also an impact on the intestine and the let's say the intestine barrier. Sorry. So just to sum up. So the dysbiosis and a hypermeability are very important because there can be a loss of the barrier effect, right, due to dysbiosis. This can lead to an increase in pathogenic bacteria. So we all have pathogenic bacteria, but I mean, depending on the level, obviously, well, there is a problem. Then, obviously, dysbiosis, will lead to altered immunity, and in the end, inflammation. And obviously, well, this just goes to show how important it is to take all these elements into account. Now, we don't have enough studies, we don't have enough data, but there is a serious case, let's say, to okay, I'll sum up here. So you have, you know, the barrier here, which is the intestine, and then you have a certain number of molecules, as you can see on the screen here, light circulation here, right? And this is the what we would call the gut barrier, and this will create this this balance between the creation of CD14s and TRL14s and cytokines, right, which will lead to the inflammation, but not only for in the context of COVID-19. Anyway, so to sum up what others have already mentioned, fatty acids are extremely important. We have, let's say, sufficient data leading us to think that they play a very important role in COVID-19. Omega-6s, omega-3s, microbiota, vitamin Ds, and micronutrients also, the nutritional status, right, which will lead to, will have an impact on the immunity and the inflammation. And then there are probably two levels of intervention we could mention. Perhaps very upstream, so in terms of prevention, the immunity could be, let's say, modulated by various nutritional factors, but this is broadly speaking, right? And then there's also the severity of the disease, which is very important. The inflammation, right? This cytokine storm. And in this case here, again, the nutritional status will play a role. And perhaps this notion of preventive food or should have been, let's say, put forward and insisted upon before the preventive measures, because food plays a very important role. The diet plays a very important role in our immune system. So I guess that we still need to continue work on these various issues, work on nutrition, because it can play this preventive role. It can act as a barrier. So my conclusion will be that the nutritional status has played a role in immunity. I mean, we've known this for years now, right? I mean, this is, and obviously, broadly speaking, right? So this means that they need to be taken into account, and this hasn't been said, let's say, enough in any case. Even though, I mean, some scientists have mentioned this fact with regards to the severity of the illness. Obviously, nutrition is not the only topic, right? You cannot stop an epidemic or a pandemic just through nutrition, but in any case, nutrition can play a very important role, right? This is what I had to say this afternoon with regards to this very important topic. Thank you very much, Professor. This very interesting presentation, which really opens, let's say, the way to many different topics. Microbiota, this is new. Obviously, we interact with the microbiota. I think you mentioned 100 trillion microbes that we have in our bodies that we need to, let's say, take into account. So this microbiota is extremely important. You've mentioned how nutrition is important when it comes namely to tackle the various health issues that we are faced with. It's not the only way of going about these issues, but it is extremely important, and this is certainly one thing that we work on. You've talked about the gut barrier and so on. But in any case, it's quite inspiring, especially for the research that will be, let's say, organized by Bleu-Blanc-Coeur in the years to come. Yes, and thank you very much. We are now going to talk about the food chain, right? And Pierre Veil will talk about this. So, well, he's not with us here. He's in his office, and he will explain to the many people in taking part in the symposium. So, farmers, people involved in the food industry, distributors. He will explain also to all these people how to act and set up virtuous industries, right, in order to meet the health objectives targeted at present so far.
Merci. Je vais y aller, donc si je peux avoir mes premières diapos.
Thank you very much.
Voilà. Donc j'ai essayé de...
Let's have the slides. Okay, so I've tried to list up what I remember from the precedent presentations. Philippe Calder said that the immunity is fed by energy and indispensable nutrients. He explains that very well in the different articles and papers that he has been publishing. Indeed, we need to feed our immunity. We need to bring food and energy to all those things that fight versus inflammation. Then Philippe Calder also spoke about the balance between omega-6 and 3. Mr. Le Cerf spoke about vitamin D that participates to the mechanisms of immunity. Microbiota participates to the regulation of immunity and inflammation. And I think that all that depends on the input. But not only, because it also depends on the way our plate is organized, our food is organized. At the beginning of this COVID crisis, we had written an article with Renan Thibault, Vincent Riot from the INSERM, starting with the hypothesis that maybe it is possible to to induce a prevention from farm to fork, or from the soil to the fork. And this has been already investigated with Philippe Calder and Professor Harris by looking at the different markers. But this balance between omega-6 and omega-3 is a balance between promotion and resolution of inflammation. So those 6 and 3, we do not manufacture them. They are being created by vegetables. It is fatty acid, which is absolutely indispensable for those two families. And then they come on our plate according to what the animals have been fed with and according to what the vegetables have become. So health prevention is linked to food chain, this unique or one health that we decided to create 20 years ago.
Membrane cellulaire avec une loupe qui vous permet de...
This is a cell membrane that helps you to find out where the omega-6 and 3 are. Professor Harris told us that the index scale of omega-3 ranges from 2% to 14%. That's an enormous difference, because this index of omega-3, which is the quantity of EPA and DHA in the membranes of the red cells, ranges between 7 and 12. So when you are at 2% in those cell membranes, or 14%, I mean, you're not going to have the same capacity to solve or to fight versus the inflammation and to have a good balance between inflammation and getting rid of it. So we raised the question, how much omega-3 do we have in our veins? Well, we do not have so much data in France. I will try to show you a few ones. This is the Calypso study, which was done by ANSES to investigate the opportunity and risks thanks to the consumption of seafood and sea product. This investigation has been done in 4 harbors in France: Toulon, Lorient, Le Havre, and La Rochelle. And here you have the omega-3 index depending on where you live. But remember, we have this index that ranges from 4 to 8, 4 for the risky zone and 8 for the comfortable one, let's say. And we are at 3.9 in Toulon, 4.4 in Lorient, 5 in Le Havre, 5.8 La Rochelle. This is below what we were expecting. Because the consumption of fish is estimated. It's a first bias, and we take a database of composition which is not always the right one, and which may change, by the way, from one fish to another, from one seafood species to another. Then Bleu-Blanc-Coeur had also released a clinical study in 1999, which is the former century. We had taken 2 population volunteers in Rennes, and we had asked people not to eat any fish or rapeseed, and they had exactly the same kind of animal products with milk and cheese and meat, but the feed of the animals was not the same. So they had the same composition, but the origin was not the same. And we had the surprise to see that we have significantly changed the membrane content of EPH and DHA in those 2 categories. We had a crossover study, 5.7 in the BBC group the trial group. And then in Lorient, a few years later, we had the population of obese volunteer people, and they had, again, they were asked not to eat any rapeseed or fish for 35 days, and they had at the beginning a very low percentage of omega-3, only 3%, and we had been able to move up to 3.6 by getting rid of fish, you see. So those data here are French. So what happens in the world? Well, that were French data. What happens in the world? Here you have several countries, and in those different countries, in yellow, these are the studies that were made to find out about the omega-3 content of the normal population without any specific pathology. When it is not colored, it means that the content of omega-3 was investigated, but for let's say specific populations, diabetes people, psychiatric people, students in a specific age category. But we have a range that goes from 12 to 3.6 in the Czech Republic. And as it was said before, between 4 to 8 for the Western countries, 9.6 for Japan, where it's very high. Now, if you oppose that to the COVID mortality, you see that this makes sense, except that it doesn't say anything. I mean, it's just an Excel table. There are many biases. There are many countries respecting the social distance, others where not, etc., where the population density is not the same, like Canada, etc. So it is impossible, in fact, to compare. However, we have now data, like we heard about in the William Harris presentation, molecule. We have studies that may correct biases constructed on the consumption. I mean, the supplementation of omega-3, like what we did. So again, it helps you to raise questions and to investigate furthermore. And we will check that out with epidemiological studies, plus the 10 to 20 clinical intervention studies with omega-3 on COVID patients. And the results start popping up, and it's quite interesting. At Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, over the past month, we asked people to fill in, I mean volunteers as usual, are not representative at all of the French population. People are eating Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, so not all the same way. Some people are retired, they are eating at home, others are working, they eat half of their meals outside, others like fish, others don't, etc. Some people have chia seeds for breakfast, or linseeds, or whatever. Anyway, we have asked them to fill in this form according to what they eat best and more. And then we have measured the quantity of omega-3 in their blood, just to take out a kind of relationship or hypothesis. To have this ratio between causes and impacts. And we confronted that with the scientific literature that we have on that subject in different countries, to say that first of all it's interesting, second it's not enough. The Bleu-Blanc-Coeur is part of the toolbox, but not alone. I think that all the things which were mentioned in the precedent presentations concentrates on nutrition. Nutrition is important, but it is not curative. So it is a sum of different things which is going to contribute to make a real difference. You need. We have seen that women have much more omega-3 than men, even when they eat the same thing. Whatever you measure in the scientific literature, you find that elderly people have much more omega-3 than young people, which is really surprising. So age makes a difference. The number of meals with fish makes a difference, once a month or twice a week. The same for the frequency of consuming Bleu-Blanc-Coeur products. Again, for people eating, having their lunch outside, for instance, it makes a difference. And then we confronted that with the body mass index. The more overweight you are, the less omega-3 you have, and the same for smokers. They have less than others. Why? I don't know. Maybe because their eating habits are different, young adults, etc. There are variation factors, but when you see this variation, you think of improvement. So again, we need different tools, and this is why we have invited so many different people. I mean, physicians, farmers, cooks, chefs. I mean, it all makes a difference, and with all those different tools, we should be able to aim at what we call the preventive health or food. I wanted to show this picture to you. It has to do with the composition of milk. There is 80% of fat in 1 liter milk that comes out of the cow, and there are only 0.2% of omega-3s in those milk lipids for cows eating corn and soya. It's not a lot. It's really not a lot. But when they eat a lot of grass, then it increases to 1.2%. And this is the same for human beings. The milk on one side and the different vegetables that you may add, and fish and meat, etc. You may increase your omega-3 content, and it is the same for animals. I wanted to show you that because if you add alfalfa or linseeds or field beans or whatever, I mean, you may increase considerably this part of lipids within the milk, and thus the omega-3. This is going to play a role later on for the health of people. The work we did for omega-3 has not been done for vitamin D, but I will try to highlight that because Jean-Michel Le Cerf mentioned vitamin D as a probable candidate acting positively on COVID and other diseases. Now, today, the consumer, to have a correct level of vitamin D, it takes 20 to 30 nanograms per milliliter. But we know that 80% of the French population has less than 30 nanograms and even 50% less than 20. So it's a real deficit. It is extremely difficult also to find out for the variation factors of vitamin D in the blood. It has something to do with sun. Of course, we know that that we may manufacture vitamin D thanks to the sun. Then we have a problem of latitude or food or whatever. So being exposed to the sun is okay, but eating correctly is also particularly important. The vitamin D3 and D2 are important and of animal origin. The D3, when you are in France, in particular in Brittany, it's quite easy because the first source for this vitamin is what you can find in butter and fish and eggs. So you see that in Japan, for instance, the main source is fish. And this is really what I would like to insist on. You may choose what you eat. It's not a problem. Vitamin D3 is an animal one, and it is even much more important than vitamin D2. And the content of 1 egg or 1 liter of milk in vitamin D may vary from 1 to 5, because animals also synthesize the vitamin D according to whether they are exposed to light or not. So wherever you are located on this planet may vary. Wherever you are, you may have different exposures to sunshine for a longer time during when daytime is longer, etc., etc. And the quantity of vitamin D on your plate may vary, not only because of your choices, but also because of the choice of the producer breeding the cow or the hen, etc., etc. And it is the same for vegetables. I have copied the screen of an American association, which is called Bionutrient Food Association. We work together to find out about vegetable and the content of nutrients. I don't know if you can read that, but they say that for carrots, for instance, we found as much polyphenol varying from 1 to 200. Just when you take the carrot out of the soil before cooking, etc., you see that it depends on the season, on the place, and the way you have fed this carrot, because it is being fed by the soil. So antioxidants and polyphenols require enzymes and substrate, etc., and the way you feed the soil is going to have consequences and impacts on the way you are going to be fed with this carrot. And we observe those variations not from 1 to 200 in our country, but from 1 to 20 without any problem for the same kind of variety, but according to how the soil has been fed and where this carrot has been grown. A take-home message maybe, or something that you could cover during the Q&A session, is that the barrier nutrients, which have been quoted most today, are fat and animals. So long-chain omega-3s, EPA, DPA, DHA, microalgae, these are animal nutrients. And the same for vitamin D3, because it is being manufactured and created by the animal, and then later on by humans. So we will talk more about that during the second day, but those participate also to animal health. And animals being well fed is going to be less sensitive to inflammation. It is to 100% dependent on the way they are being, well, bred, because the breeding management is major. Animals that can appreciate the sunshine and eat grass, etc. And nutriments during the second day of this symposium may also become markers of a good environmental health, the stocking of CO2, etc. And for vegetable nutriments, in particular, antioxidants, fibers, polyphenols, etc., all those things which are going to feed our microbiota, the composition may vary enormously according to fertilizing season, variety, but also the quality of the life within the soil. So in particular, the carbon content of the soil. So the different production possibilities may impact also the quality of what we eat and our health.
De densité nutritionnelle, mais aussi d'impact environnemental. Dans les deux cas, ça se mesure.
Nutritional density and environmental impact, both things can be measured, and I want to insist on that because it is particularly important, and it can't become a kind of whole and empty marketing claim. It's a little bit more complicated than just saying eat local and eat according to seasons. a little bit more complex. And the same way I raised the question about omega-3, the same way I could speak about CO2. At Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, we have started measuring or publishing things about the carbon footprint. And we have done our first analysis of life cycle to go beyond the climate change in study that we did in 2007. And now we move on to the unique score and aggregating all the different environmental scores and not only climate change. And today we may qualify a Bleu-Blanc-Coeur egg with a CO2 of minus 18%, and the 3 to 4 nitrogen index, etc. This is a kind of double scoring system. This is an abstract of one of the numerous articles which were written on nutrition and immunity. It is a call for omnivorism, if I may say so. Eat everything, a little bit of everything. You see that the nutriments are on the right-hand side and the trace elements on the left-hand side. You have everything there. So it takes everything on your plate. Eat a little bit of everything. Be reasonable. And it's not maybe, but it's not enough. Again, it takes to eat a little bit from everything, but with a high variety, with plants and animals which have been nourished and fed well. Because it is particularly important for our health. It goes from the soil to the plant, from the plant to the animal, from the animal to humans. When Bleu-Blanc-Coeur published the first results of the year, which is controlled, by the way, we found out a total of 900 tons of omega-3 transformed in DHA or from the air, but this is not the only thing that we did. We also improved the landscape. So we have less corn, less imported soya, more grass, more alfalfa, more rapeseed and field beans and linseeds and peas. And then we also improved the environment with less usage of phytosanitary products and less CO2 rejected in the atmosphere. This is our meter. And all those micronutrients that we have mentioned have an importance to fight versus inflammation. And the content within our body may resist to better master immunity and inflammation. But this depends on the way we decide to eat and also the way the soil has been nourished. This is really what we are strong with. It has a double impact on nutrition and on the environment. This is the beginning of a conclusion. The virus is strong when you are weak. This is the publication of a research group from Quebec. I think it's interesting to have this virus that goes around those people because they are obese or because they are aged, inflammaging, this inflammation that raises with age. The beginning, the diminishing of immunity when you age, all this brings us about to say that nutrition, the one that is going to simulate our defenses, to the one which is going to help us to resist to COVID-19, has to become accessible for all, in particular for elderly. This is not scientific. However, it has to be at the disposal of the greatest possible number. It has to be accessible for fragile people, be it for economic reasons or logistical reasons. Some people have no access to a quality food, despite the fact that they deserve it. So One Health is not only something that we speak about, it is something that we do. It is a measurable concept. We do not call it we have changed the name of this strategy, but it is ours for 20 years now. From farm to fork is something which is particularly important and helps to measure what we bring into our blood. It is also a way which is it is difficult, a very narrow path, but we will go on investigating those results and our strategy with the second day of this symposium on the 28th of September with impact on animal health and ecosystems. One Health is a lively and healthy soil. It is it is something that it is more than wishful thinking. Of course, we do everything we can to achieve that. And if the scientific basis is solid, then we will go on. And again, the path is narrow. And if we get evidences, and it is sometimes difficult to get the evidence, however, we will go on trying to get those evidences. And we have not talked about nutrition in link with COVID, but it will happen. There is a group. There are many teachers in American universities who have asked their students to count the number of balls hit on the basketball ground. And during that counting, there is a gorilla, a person disguised as a gorilla crossing the playground. And they haven't seen this gorilla. It is amazing. This is something that we call the non-attention incidents, and I think that not speaking about nutrition in link with COVID is part of this phenomenon, but we will come to it. So thank you very much to all. Thank you very much. Pierre.
This was a very inspiring talk. Thank you very much. You stay with us, right? Because we are now going to move to the Q&A session. So please stay with us. Right, so for this Q&A session, Nathalie, we've asked a certain number of speakers to join us. So we have Professor Calder, Professor Harris. We also have Ronan Thibault, who's joined us, and Pierre Veil. So concerning the questions, the first question will go to Philippe Calder. So we've heard a lot about vitamin Ds and omega-3s. Are these two nutrients complementary or even synergistic?
Yeah, that's a good question. And of course, although in these two sessions we have focused on omega-3s and vitamin D, there are a number of other nutrients which are also important. Other fat-soluble vitamins, water-soluble vitamins, minerals like zinc, copper, selenium, iron. These are all really important in supporting the immune system, in controlling inflammation, in influencing the gut microbiota. Also phytochemicals chemicals from plants, so the polyphenols and so on. Of course, all of these nutrients have their own individual biological actions. So I very much focused on omega-3s, their actions. But when we consume them in the diet, we're consuming the whole mix of nutrients. And really, they're working together in the body. We hope that they are working together in a positive way. But of course, actually, some of them may act to oppose the actions of one another. So I don't think there's a magic bullet for nutrition. All of the nutrients that have been mentioned are important, and we really need them together. I think one thing is the way nutrition works is to help cells to function. And likely cells need a whole mix of nutrients to function in the proper way, in the best way. And it doesn't make a lot of sense that a single nutrient will help the situation totally, that there will be a mix of nutrients that are important. And therefore, in thinking about the question, they're probably working synergistically rather than, one or two being the answer to all of the issues.
Merci beaucoup, Professeur Calder.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Professor Calder. So we now have a question for Renan Thibault.
Merci beaucoup.
So thank you very much, Professor Renan Thibault. So you are a professor, you work for the hospital in Rennes. I think this question goes for you, but in any case, I'm asking you. In Pierre's presentation at the end of this session, it was, he talked about aging people. Do you believe that nutrition is dealt with sufficiently for these people, and especially in the COVID-19 management?
Peut-être.
We can't hear you, Professor.
Bon, à savoir que nous sommes en direct, bien sûr.
Okay, well, we are live here, so I don't know if you can hear us. Could you please try again?
Non, a priori le micro est.
No, your mic is probably muted. Well, it doesn't matter. We'll check this out with our tech team. Well, what I suggest is that we could ask a question for Professor Harris. Oh, do we have Renan Thibault online?
Oui, bonjour à tous.
Yes. Ah, super. We can hear him. Right. Great.
Voilà, y a pas de souci.
Okay. So, well, thank you very much, Natalie, for this question. Thank you very much for this really, really interesting symposium. So, yeah, aging people are, it is true, usually, let's say, underfed or not fed well enough, right? And in Rennes, for instance, we are working on a study in order to see if nutrition with the sufficient amount of omega-3 could allow to, let's say, delay the loss of control of their health and of the body of aging people. And we know that it's very difficult to do so. I'm taking the defense of catering teams and health services, health teams, because, well, depending on the food supplies, but just the management of aging people can be complicated. But I believe that, food is important, and not necessarily food supplements, right? Because it's been seen in various studies, namely by Professor Harris and Calder, right? Then we have a third question here, which is for all of you. Perhaps, who wants to answer, please go for it, even though you're several here on the screen. So the question is, should we understand that animal products, although they are really quite today, have an important place to take back in the management of a favorable diet for our health, or a diet that is favorable for our health, sorry.
Allez, qui souhaite répondre à cette question?
Who wants to answer this question?
Oui, Professeur Calder.
Professor Calder, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, someone has to go first. So I think this is a good question because there's quite a move away from animal foods. Now, Pierre showed a table from a review I wrote about nutrition immunity in COVID-19, where the important nutrients were listed down the left-hand side, and the foods that supply those nutrients were on the right-hand side. And the point of producing that table was to demonstrate that to get all of the nutrients that are important to our immune system, we need quite a diverse and balanced diet. And that includes both plant-based and animal-based foods, because there are a number of essential nutrients that are much more available in animal foods than from plant foods. So, I mean, vitamin D would be an obvious one. Long-chain omega-3s would be another one. I'm including fish here, of course, as an animal food. Zinc is another one. Vitamin B12, which is difficult to get from plants, but is abundant in animal foods. So I think this is something which is maybe missing from the debate, the important contribution that animal foods make to the intake of essential nutrients. So I hope my answer is clear on that point.
Well, absolutely. Thank you very much, Professor. So, Professor Harris, on to you. I think you have a question. Perhaps you want to add on to Professor Calder's answer? No? If not, then I have a question for you. Several questions, by the way. And namely with regards to the omega-3 index. And by the way, I see that we have many questions, but we will come back to you with the various answers, having discussed this with our experts. So with regards to the omega-3 index, so many different questions. How does it work in practice, right? Because you mentioned measuring the omega index, right? So a good omega-3 index in order to work on prevention, namely prevention of COVID-19 or other diseases, right? So what is the right level? You talked about the various variations, but from what level on could we believe that we are in, let's say, that we are healthy? And is there a difference between men and women?
Yeah, and I would like to, I think, echo what Philip said about there isn't just one magic bullet here in our diet. We focus on omega-3s because we think they're maybe particularly deficient in Western diets and very actionable. We can do something about them. And so, I don't want to give the impression that I think only omega-3 fatty acids play a role here. How do we get an omega-3 index high? Well, obviously we eat EPA and DHA. The way we can measure it, of course, is we typically do it with a dried blood spot. A kit is sent to a person at home when they order it off of a website, and they receive the kit, prick a finger, put a drop of blood on a card, and mail it back in, and then we provide the omega-3 index. Other labs do it the same way, so some use whole blood. So it's a directly measurable metric. Why 8%? 8% seems to have been basically from back in the 2004 when we first proposed the omega-3 index. The evidence seemed to point to a level around 8%. If you're going to define it as a risk factor, you have to actually have a target value, of course. And so we came up with Dr. Von Schacke and I as we proposed this metric. And that's been held up, I think, throughout the years. It's not to say that there's some bright white line that happens between 7.9 and 8.1. It's totally a continuum. Being on the lower end is bad, being on the upper end is good, and 6 is better than 4, 7 is better than 5, etc. So I'm not sure I totally answered the question, but I'll leave it at that.
Well, okay. Now there was perhaps one clarification concerning the difference between men and women with regards to omega-3 and their needs and so on. Pierre touched upon this. Could you believe that women have an advantage compared to men? Could you explain this, if this is the case, and what the mechanism is to explain it?
Yes, women, particularly premenopausal, when women are fertile and able to have babies, they have higher DHA levels, somewhat higher, I mean, not vastly higher, but higher DHA levels than men. This is presumably to prepare the mother, the woman, to become pregnant and produce a baby, because the baby has a huge demand for DHA in particular. So women, and the way this works is through estrogen. The hormone will increase the rate of conversion of ALA to EPA and DHA. And so that goes away in the 40s and 50s, and women who are in their 60s and 70s have omega-3 levels that are the same as men. So that's, and we published recently actually that women who are given estrogen in a large randomized trial here in the US do have an increased level of not only EPA or not only DHA, but also some of the long-chain omega-6 fatty acids that are stimulated to be made by estrogen.
Merci beaucoup.
Well, thank you very much. Now we have a question for all of you, gentlemen. So once again, open. So how would you explain that your work, which let's say goes towards scientific truth, right, namely that food is a policy tool for public health, could be ignored by the international authorities in the management of COVID-19?
Allez-y, celui qui souhaite répondre.
Feel free to go for it, right?
Philippe,
I can
allez-y.
start again because this is actually something which I have occasionally said something about. So one of the and I don't know the reason, but this is quite a mystery. So one of the things that happened here in the UK quite early in the coronavirus pandemic was it was realized that people with obesity are at higher risk. And the government recognized this within about 6 weeks of the start of the pandemic. And they started quite an activity around physical activity, weight management, and so on. So there was lots of advertisements on television, on the radio, there were posters in bus shelters and so on. So they got the idea that obesity was a risk factor pretty quickly, and they started doing something about it. But one of the things that I was always very curious about is why they didn't make statements about healthy eating, because healthy eating is important all the time, whether you're in a COVID-19 pandemic or not. And chances are that healthy eating would help people in their immune protection, and certainly it wouldn't be harmful. So I'm at a loss to know why people haven't used the pre-existing information to promote more healthy aspects of lifestyle. And the only thing I can think of is that because consumers were really looking for answers, that the authorities may have thought it was misleading to make people think that diet could be protective in case it wasn't. I mean, that's really the only thing I can think of. I don't know whether other people have got something to say about that.
Merci beaucoup. Non, c'est...
Well, in any case, thank you very much, Professor. No, thank you very much for answering this question. We'll perhaps come back to another question for you, Professor Calder. But now we have a question from Nathalie, just to react on what you just said. I guess that our minister that started this session, she talked about the importance of having the right approach to agriculture in order to promote the right nutrition, right? So we're talking about prevention, we're talking about health. I think a question on the microbiota would be important. So how can omega-3s, let's say, play a part on the good status of the microbiota? Perhaps Pierre could answer this? Or Ronan? I don't know. Pierre? Well, I can only echo what my scientific council has touched upon, and namely two theses recently with regards to the links between omega-3s and the microbiota. I don't know if it's Michel Mars, I don't know if he's with us and if he's listening, from the University of Dijon, and who also works for INSERM. He has published very, very interesting studies. I didn't really understand all of it, I must say, but anyway, very interesting works, and namely with regards to the impact of omega-3s, and namely in link with the microbiota. So it's quite complex. One thing I understood, I think, is the transfer of microbiota of different mice who produce their own omega-3s, and so you use the microbiota of those that produce a lot of omega-3s, right, because they're young and so on. And when you use this microbiota with a lot of omega-3s and inserted in normal mice, which do not produce their own omega-3, well, the impact is the normal impact of omega-3s, right? Well, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I don't know enough about this, unfortunately. But I would say that the link, as you asked the question, right, perhaps that we could let people get into contact with Michel Lars, because his thesis on the link between omega-3 and microbiota is really, really interesting, quite astonishing, I would say. And I think there is a real link between the two. But I'm going to stop here. And perhaps, people who ask this question, we could direct them towards our experts, because this is a very interesting topic, and we've spent quite some time studying this issue. Yeah, Ronan, please go ahead. Yeah. I think that the link has not been established that clearly between the microbiota and other nutrients. In another clinical study that we've been working on with pregnant women, and so eating Bleu-Blanc-Coeur food, and women who are not eating Bleu-Blanc-Coeur food, we'll see if the microbiota of their babies will evolve differently. And I hope that we will have additional answers to provide to this question. All right, well, thank you very much. Now, concerning the other questions, there's so many that have been asked. I hope that Bleu-Blanc-Coeur will be able to answer them on the network, on social network, sorry. So we have a last question for Professor Calder. Perhaps Professor Harris could jump in also. You talked about the important role of omega-3s in order to, as a resolver of inflammation. But could couldn't the excess of omega-6 also be to blame, and shouldn't a reduction in omega-6 be recommended?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think in general, the omega-6 and omega-3 fatty acids act in opposing ways, and really a balance between them. So I talked about arachidonic acid as an omega-6 fatty acid and EPA and DHA as omega-3 fatty acids. And I think, don't forget the chemicals produced from arachidonic acid are also important. It's just when they're produced in excess amounts that there's a problem. So I think a balance between arachidonic acid on one hand and EPA and DHA on the other in cell membranes will be important. And people have done studies giving omega-3s whilst also reducing intake of arachidonic acid, and they've shown that that works better than just giving omega-3s on their own. So I do think this question of balance is very important, but it's actually quite difficult to investigate that in human studies for lots of reasons. But I think it's a good question, and I do agree. Reducing omega-6 intake is a way of achieving some of the things that giving omega-3s can bring. Although I do feel giving omega-3s is a superior option. I don't know if Bill agrees with that.
Merci beaucoup, Nathalie. Vous vouliez...
Well, in any case, thank you very much. Nathalie, you want to add something? Perhaps Professor Harris wants to add to what's been said?
Yeah, I certainly agree that a balance is important. The question is, what is the balance? And I know omega-6 fatty acids have gotten a bad reputation, largely because of the metabolites that they give rise to. But I think we have to be careful because some people are advocating removing omega-6, lowering omega-6 levels in the diet. And I think there may be some adverse effects to that, some unintended consequences, because the omega-6s, we can't just look at them in the context of the omega-3, omega-6 balance. There's an entire body of data that's growing that says higher levels of omega-6 fatty acids, linoleic particularly, the parent omega-6, is beneficial, both for reducing risk for cardiovascular disease, for total mortality, and for diabetes. And so I think before we rush to completely vilify the omega-6 fatty acids, we have to be careful and realize that they give rise to important metabolites that we may not be measuring yet.
Eh oui, tout à fait.
Well, absolutely. Natalie, you want to add to this? No, I don't think so. Perhaps we could bring an end to this Q&A session, because there's so many questions anyway, but we'll come back to them later on. Thank you very much for bearing with us. Thank you very much for answering all these questions, gentlemen. So this is the end of the Q&A session, and so we are now going to continue our discussion with someone who comes from the presidential palace. So not a minister, but he is the the chef of the Élysée. No, he's no longer the chef. He is the French president's representative ambassador representing gastronomy. Well, so the president eats Bleu-Blanc-Coeur food. Good. So Guillaume Gomez is with us, and he has something to say with regards to his vision of gastronomy and this healthy food topic.
Hello, everybody, and I'm very happy to be with you. Guillaume Gomez, I'm Meilleur Ouvrier de France. I have been working at the Élysée Palace for 25 years. I've been chef over there, and now I am the private consultant of the President of the Republic. And I created a few months ago this role of ambassador of Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, and it is true that all the speakers we heard before and what they said makes sense, because health means that it is the consequence of our food, and this will be particularly important for the future. So, I mean, nutrients, health, but also good things, you know, the yummy things. That's particularly important for us. Not only cooks and chefs, but also the transformation or the processing industry of food. So, what is important for me is to know that the ones producing our food on our soils, our farmers, etc., need to be supported, and the chefs really do what is necessary in this way. It is obvious that on the plate itself, the work of the chef has to care. I mean, beyond just the taste, has to care for the respect of a healthy preparation. And this is something that we cherish for our job and for tomorrow. I mean, the way we cook, you know, the old recipes, we had mentioned those typical French plate like bœuf carotte, which is beef meat with carrot, a kind of stew which is made with red wine. I mean, all this is important, you see. But we thought for a long time that this was just the traditional way of preparing a piece of meat. In fact, it's much more than that, because in the red wine you have polyphenols, because in the meat you have good things, because in the carrots you also have good things and nutrients, etc. So all this leads to a healthy food. A few years ago, it was something that could be considered as outsider, because what was healthy was not yummy, what was healthy was not linked to pleasure in eating, etc. And now more and more we have yummy things and good things with less fat, or the good fat. And what is important beyond all that is to say that it is not because there is less sugar or less fat that it's not good. So we do respect the nutriments of what is left in this food. We look at the way it is being cooked and processed, and it means for us that it is possible to cook well and to make tasty recipes while respecting our health. I'm particularly proud to contribute to what you do at Bleu-Blanc-Coeur. I'm very happy to see that, because I'm not the only one participating, that we can achieve all that. And if the image and the reputation of French chefs is the one it is now, it is also because over the past years we integrated all those elements. So it's very interesting to be part of a symposium like this one, because we grow and we build together the food of tomorrow. What is particularly interesting also is the fact that sharing a good moment, spending a good moment all together around one dish goes along with being healthy. From the moment on, you share my table, I will also care about your health. This is something that was not respected at all a few years ago, not even in cuisine schools or trainings or roundtable discussions where all the chefs and the pâtissiers came together. I mean, we still have a lot of things to talk about, don't worry. But I mean, it was not, we did not talk about it at that time. And now, together, we all move towards an interesting way of eating. We have the International Days of Fruit and Vegetables. We are looking for this cuisine which is oriented towards vegetables. I mean, a human being is supposed to eat everything, so the food has to combine all that. But we need to think about it. We are accountable. We need to think about it. Very often we talk about this program, which is called From Farm to Fork. A long time ago, chefs, when they prepared their menu, were not thinking about that, you know. They were just thinking about having nice, tasty things. They did not look at the way it was produced. They did not look at the variety of products they were using, like semen and seeds and all that. The way you work with a product is also very important. It's important to respect the product and not to change it in terms of taste, but also by eliminating, because you cook in a certain way, eliminating a nutriment that may contribute to your health. So the no waste concept has become important. Methanization of waste, all this has become important. So in fact, it's not from farm to fork; it is from farm to the bin, and this is what we work on more and more. So we rely on this French gastronomy and healthy agriculture. It took a certain number of years and sanitary scandals of the food industry before people probably raised the question about what am I eating? What am I giving my body? How am I transforming all those things that I'm going to take in? And we started explaining this whole food chain, the work of the farmer, the work of the breeder, the work of the cook, etc., while keeping this yummy aspect, you know, this tasty thing. Because what I want to tell you is that, of course, it is our first drug, food. I mean, food has to be good for our health. But if it is just to eat juices of this and that, or ersatz products of something else, or things that would be grown in a lab, then we would move away from the tasty food. And this is not what we want. But we want a healthy food. We want it better for our health, for the health of others, for society, and for the whole planet. So thank you very much for organizing this symposium. Thank you very much for the work you do and the work that we will be doing together. We want all together to contribute to the reputation of the French gastronomy, and everybody is part of that, and you are part of it. So we start with the farmer, And thank you very much for the work you do. Thank you, Chef, for this presentation that reconciled the papilla of our mouth with the ones or the villi of our microbiota and intestinal barrier. We are very proud to have you part of those 17,000 members, part of this community. Now it's time to conclude already this first part of the symposium dedicated to human health. I would like to thank all the speakers who have shown their pedagogical and communication talent. We had a very nice afternoon all together. Should I sum up in a few keywords all these presentations, I could say that we have opened up the field of agriculture dedicated to health. Even our Minister of Agriculture explained that it is important. We could discover a certain number of very important scientific elements, like the nutriments of our food do regulate the immunity, inflammation, manage our microbiota, all those things that participate in a good health. And now that we know all that, we need to integrate that in our daily work and in our daily way of doing things. I mean, we can't go on saying we didn't know. From now on, it is impossible. I consider that nutrition has to find its place in the toolbox, as Pierre was saying. Nutrition is much more important than a drug, because a drug is too heavy. Food is fine, is a regulation. So, and to go on the field, we have the team of Bleu-Blanc-Coeur, the farmers, the breeders, all the actors, the participants, and it will be our role to participate in that work. It's a beautiful conclusion, Nathalie. Thank you all very much. Now, we, of course, will eat with Guillaume Lemesse. We will bring a whole bunch of good products. And the next meeting is the 28th of September. We already know what is going to happen. We will talk about the collateral impacts of health, nutrition, and climate. We will listen to Michel Duru and Perrault from the INRA, Michel Perrault from and Dr. de Margerie from the INRA and Valorex, and also the participation of an economist from the INRA, Philippe Legrand. And he will conclude, Louis-Georges Soler is the economist of the INRA, and Professor Philippe Legrand will conclude that second round of discussion. Thank you very much. Eat Bleu-Blanc-Coeur and have a nice time.